Hey everybody, for upcoming school year, we go to school in around 28 days. I think we have about 28 days of summer left before classes start. So I'm just kind of getting rolling back into the flow of things. It's been a really great week for me, preparing to teach my first sociobiology class. I'm kind of coming off the reading of chapter 4 and 5 of E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience. And I am just finishing up part 4 of the psychological significance of the biblical stories, which is the emergence of consciousness. It's where Dr. Peterson finally gets to Adam and Eve in that 4th lecture, which is a great lecture. There's lots of biology in that, lots of evolution, talk about how human beings evolved, how our sight evolved, how our vision co-evolved with snakes, and the connection between those things and the stories, those ancient stories, seem pretty profound and are they're very interesting to observe. So. And then the other thing that I've recently finished was just recently finished reading C.G. Jung's The Red Book. So consciousness is really on my mind right now, and all of this is kind of focusing myself on what I did my first video on, which was sorting myself out as an educator. I'm about in year 12 now of teaching. I teach biology. As I said, I'm starting the sociobiology class at Mount DeSales Academy, a wonderful Catholic school in Macon, Georgia. And a lot of this sociobiology class is going to be about consciousness, and it is something that we're going to focus on extensively. So this idea of consciousness is foundational to me. Our understanding of consciousness is foundational to me in what it is that I want my students to learn, what it is my students need to be able to see as they learn to encounter the world. I was watching the Rebel Wisdom video. I'm really focusing on kind of sorting myself out as an educator, and if to me, if education is going to evolve, I think about education evolving a lot, and if education is going to evolve, it's my understanding that it's first has to evolve within me. I was in our upper school head's office one day earlier this year, and we were Dr. Franklin and I were having a great conversation about some of these ideas and focusing on consciousness, and we were talking about just my teaching methods and my teaching practices. And it's one of the things he asked me. He said, well, how much of this are you doing? How much of this are you acting out in the classroom? How are you trying to be a better teacher? And that that pushes you. That pushed me in a positive direction, because it is a learning process to do whatever you're doing. It's a learning process to do that better and to do that with greater understanding and with greater knowledge about your students as individuals, and also just your students, who your students are, and understanding. Nothing has done more for me in teaching than an understanding of human consciousness. It's why we act the way we act. It's why we think the way we think. It is, and that kind of presents the hard problem of human consciousness, which is kind of what is human consciousness. And so, kind of to start with what we know, and if you're going to explain something, you got to start with what you know. And kind of what we know about human consciousness is very little. So kind of where do we start? Well, you start, if you don't know something, then you make theories about it. You make hypotheses about it. This is the scientific method. This is how we act these things out, which is one of the things that Dr. Peterson always talks about. Is what your religion is what you act out. And or what you act out is just as important as what you think or what you say you believe. So I've come up with this idea, or one of my axioms that I'm trying to teach from is that human consciousness is kind of the crown jewel of evolution. And this is something I really do believe. In one of the psychological significance of the biblical stories lectures, Dr. Peterson talks about consciousness being cosmically significant. It's a uniting force because it's something we all experience. It kind of goes back to that idea I've talked about before on my channel that Robert Sapolsky, Dr. Sapolsky at Stanford, the evolutionary biologist, he talks about his behavioral evolution class being mandatory. Well, why does it need to be mandatory? Because it is a biological explanation of human consciousness, how we know what we know, how we think, why we behave certain ways, and you explain that, when you see that in terms of consciousness, you understand that all human beings experience this, all human beings go through this, and that, that in my mind is where there is human connection on a level that really increases your trust, really increases your understanding, because you know exactly what another person is going through in a lot of ways when you understand human consciousness, or when you try to understand human consciousness. So what does human consciousness do? Well, it from an evolutionary standpoint, it has a role of kind of adapting us to the reality of our minds and the reality of our current and many cultures and societies and interactions in our environment that we face every day. Consciousness adapts us to those things. It from an evolutionary standpoint, it's what allows us to walk through life with the understanding that we have and make the decisions that we make. And this is something, again, that we have a very small understanding of, and that's something that I feel like needs to change. I think all learners need to know where from an academic standpoint, for me as a teacher, I think all learners need to know as much about the fundamental nature of consciousness as we can explain it, how it impacts our reality, how an understanding of who we are impacts our reality, because it does impact what it is that we experience, what it is that we know, and how else can you act unless by what you know. So the hard problem of consciousness is kind of what is consciousness, and this is one of the things that, in my opinion, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris are trying to figure out through their discussions. Interestingly, I read something again that I talked about yesterday, is in the Spectator article where the guy Harris is discussing these ideas and what these religious stories have done to human consciousness, or what these spiritual experiences, for him, meditation, what it does for his consciousness. And Harris said he's had some experiences where he would, if he were a religious person, consider them spiritual, but he knows that that's kind of not what it is that those experiences were. And Dr. Peterson very calmly, and apparently in a very comical way, says, well, you need a higher dose. And so what have these higher doses of spiritual experiences done to our consciousness throughout time, throughout history? How have our constant evolving of consciousness, how has the constant evolving of consciousness given rise to our current understanding of the world? To me, consciousness is a principle that has to be understood in biological terms. It is kind of the framework of evolution. The framework that evolution gave us, has really increased our understanding of biology, increased our understanding of how we got to where we are right now. That is the one reason that that's capable or that's possible is evolution really focuses on synthesis, and multiple things coming together just by its very nature. Evolution is a lot of pieces being able to adapt an organism to its current environment. It's not a reductionist understanding. That's one of the reasons why Peterson says it's Darwinian presuppositions are more important than Newtonian presuppositions. This is this idea that, this reductionist science or the objective world is the only world that we need to be grounded in. But this is kind of where maps of meaning comes into play, because maps of meaning is technically Dr. Peterson walking out both the objective world, and this is where he talks about the world could be construed as a place of tools. In the place of tools, you understand the place of tools through the techniques of science and understanding the scientific method and breaking things down into reductionist material things that you can grasp. That's what physics does. You can take gravity and you can reduce it down to something that you can say, and then something that you can mathematically prove. And our understanding increases, and we can synthesize that from there. It's very difficult to do that in biology. It's very difficult to do that in biology because of the multiple factors that our genes play, the multiple factors that our, Sapolsky said, it's very much something that we know is, what happens in our head impacts our body, and what happens in our body impacts what is going on in our mind. We know that. It's why we are the most complex things that there are. And again, the greatest part of that is our consciousness. But we know nothing about it. We know very little about it, and that's something that, if we are to focus on this one thing, or the more we focus on this one thing in education and in our walk away moment, we will gain a better understanding of who we are. We'll gain a better understanding of who the people we are walking away towards are. We'll get a better understanding of who we're walking away from. And when you do that, you're able to see things more in completion. And that's another thing, Jung talked about when I mentioned the Red Book earlier. Jung, his understanding of consciousness, his experience of the unconscious, really grounded him in this fact that we have to see things, or we have to seek things in completion rather than perfection. And in my opinion, that's why his consciousness, or his understanding of consciousness, superseded most everybody else's. And I think one of the interesting things about maps of meaning is in kind of an outlying, I consider it very much like an outlying old map that the explorers would have put on the atlas, right? We're trying to make maps of land. It seems to me that maps of meaning is kind of those old sketches of consciousness. It's a representation of consciousness. It's a map of what consciousness is and what consciousness does, and how consciousness does what it is it does. Make it do what it do, to use a funny phrase. I try to be funny. It wasn't funny though. So that's something that we've been focused on. I'm really trying hard to give my students a grounding in consciousness as best as I possibly can, because I think it is the crown jewel of evolution. I think it is something that we can walk away as a society. We could walk away from our old simple reductionist understanding of humans and our simple reductionist understanding of identity and tribalism and all of these things that make us walk away. Why does it make us do that? It's because our consciousness is telling us, hey man, that's not the answer. We can look at our world and we can see the problems that we're having. For me as an educator, I can see that, again, education needs to evolve. How's education going to evolve? I think it starts with consciousness. As you walk away from a previous life, now this is, you could consider this your Exodus moment. You're moving away from, you could also consider it your Adam and Eve moment, where you've now become awake. You've experienced a consciousness that you haven't experienced before. It seems to me that the further you walk that path out, the better you'll understand yourself. The better you'll understand other people. And if you're attempting to learn, if you're attempting to grow, then you'll become more educated. You'll become more knowledgeable, and ultimately you'll become wiser, which is a pretty helpful tool in life. Anyway, those are my thoughts for the day on walk away. Let me know what you think, or if you think anything, and hope to talk to you soon.